As the American torpedo boat PT109 patrolled in the Solomon Islands on the dark night of August 2nd, 1943, a Japanese destroyer loomed out of the shadows at point-blank range. Before the boat's captain, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, can react, there was a shattering collision. PT109 was cut in half, scattering the crew and starting a story of survival that would make Kennedy a war hero and kickstart his post-war political ambitions. When John F. Kennedy entered the torpedo boat arm of the US Navy in September 1942 as a prospective boat commander, it was no accident. His father, Joseph Kennedy, had weeks earlier pulled strings to ensure his second-born son would be recommended. Kennedy Sr. was focused on setting both of his older sons up for potential runs at the presidency in the future and was keen that John should, in the words of renowned torpedo boat skipper John Bulkley, get into PT boats for the publicity, to get the veterans vote after the war. After completing training in April 1943, Lieutenant Kennedy took up command of Motor Torpedo Boat 109, part of Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 based at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. On July 15th, Kennedy's boat was ordered forward to the newly captured outpost at Rendova, right on the front line of the Allied advance up the Solomons. About 25 boats from various squadrons were positioned here under the command of Lieutenant Commander Thomas Warfield. PT-109 took part in operations designed to harass Japanese supply lines and support other Allied air and naval assets in the area. The torpedo boats operated at night, which offered the greatest concealment from Japanese aircraft and surface ships, but also caused chronic communication problems, especially since they were ordered to maintain strict radio silence. On the night of July 17th, 12 of Warfield's boats attacked a column of enemy destroyers to the south of Kolombangara. 10 torpedoes were launched and all of them missed, which was just as well as the destroyers were in fact American and had been misidentified. 2 weeks later, Warfield's flotilla received intelligence that a major resupply operation for the Japanese garrison at Villa was planned for the night of August 1st, to be carried out by a force of destroyers. Warfield was ordered to deploy his boats into the Vella Gulf to intercept the enemy vessels. The Americans had 15 torpedo boats available, of which 4 were equipped with radar. Warfield divided his force into 4 groups, each headed by a radar boat, and deployed them in a series of picket lines to ambush the enemy force as it progressed southwards. PT-109 was assigned to Division B, the northernmost group stationed off the western coast of Kolombangara and led by Lieutenant Henry Brantingham. By the late evening of August 1st, the torpedo boats were in position. To maintain surprise, they were all under radio silence, with each boat relying on keeping visual contact with the boats ahead of it on what was a dark, moonless night. Shortly after midnight, Brantingham's PT-159 picked up enemy contacts on radar heading towards them at 15 knots. Brantingham turned his boat towards the enemy, followed by Lieutenant Liebnau's PT-157, but the other 2 boats in his division had lost sight of their leader and, as they were under radio silence, had no way of knowing what was going on. Brantingham and Liebnau pressed their attack, soon coming under intense fire as they lined up and then fired their torpedo tubes. All of them missed, and the 2 boats turned directly for home as ordered by Lieutenant Commander Warfield. This left Kennedy's PT-109 and the PT-162 completely blind, with no idea that an engagement with the Japanese had even taken place. With no sign of their division leader, the 2 boats turned south, heading slowly towards the island of Gizo. Meanwhile, the Battle of Blackett Strait was fast descending into a farce for the Americans. Attacks by Divisions A and C went much the same way as the first engagement, with the lead ship using radar to locate and attack, and others behind having little idea what was happening. Each time the radar boats were withdrawn, leaving the remaining craft blind, with some launching uncoordinated attacks when they caught sight of the enemy by chance. By 12:30 am, 24 torpedoes had been fired by the Americans, with every single one missing the target, allowing the Japanese ships to arrive at Villa without a scratch. When the destroyers began their return leg an hour and a half later, a handful of uncoordinated boats awaited them. On the bridge of PT-109, Kennedy and his crew braced themselves, eyes fixed to the horizon. Suddenly, at 2:27 am, a cry went out from Harold Marney on the starboard machine gun. "Ship at 2 o'clock." Kennedy looked up, and sure enough, looming out of the mist at point-blank range was the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, dwarfing the little torpedo boat. The Americans had no time to react. Kennedy turned the boat towards the destroyer in the hopes of firing a torpedo straight down its throat, but Amagiri followed the turn, going hard to starboard to keep on a collision course. Seconds later, Amagiri smashed into PT109's fragile wooden hull, tearing it in half. A huge fireball erupted as gasoline in the boat's tanks ignited. When the flames subsided, all was dark again, as the Japanese ships continued on their way. 11 of PT109's crewmen had survived, clinging to the still afloat bow section. For a while, the crew remained there, hoping that a nearby PT boat might have seen what had happened and come looking for them. But after a few hours, the arrival of morning revealed only an empty sea. The crew of PT109 were on their own. The wreckage drifted slowly southeastwards through August 2nd and slowly began to sink. By 1 PM, it looked likely that it would soon fall beneath the waves entirely, so the crew would have to try and get to dry land. The trouble was, the closest islands were Kolombangara to the north and Gizo to the south, both of which were occupied by Japanese troops. Not fancying being captured, Lieutenant Kennedy suggested they try and make for a tiny island further to the east known as Plum Pudding Island, which looked too small to be worth garrisoning by the enemy. The problem was that this island was more than 3.5 miles away, and of the surviving crew, one, Patrick McMahon, was badly burned, and 2 others couldn't swim at all. Nevertheless, they set off at 2 PM, with most of the crew clustered around a makeshift wooden raft to support those that couldn't swim, while Kennedy swam the distance with McMahon on his back. It was an extraordinary feat of physical endurance. Miles of swimming over open sea in a tropical heat, in full view of any passing Japanese aircraft or ship. After 4 hours, at 6 PM, Kennedy and McMahon made it to the island, joined soon afterwards by the other 9 survivors. Meanwhile, back at Rendova, the loss of PT109 had been noted. Crews that had seen the immense fireball reported that they thought it likely the boat had gone down with all hands, and no attempts to find survivors were launched the following day. But this wasn't the end of all hopes for Kennedy's crew, as the boat's end had also been witnessed by 2 Allied coast watchers embedded in secret on Kolombangara. New Zealand Sub-Lieutenant Arthur Evans and US Army Corporal Benjamin Nash worked with the assistance of local Solomon Islanders to gather intelligence on Japanese movements and positions and aid in recovering downed Allied airmen. On August 2nd, the 2 coast watchers tracked the wreckage of PT109 as it drifted southeast. Sub-Lieutenant Evans put the word out to their network of local scouts to keep an eye out for any survivors. Back on Plum Pudding Island, Kennedy was not prepared to simply wait for rescue, as the lack of fresh water and food where they were put a clock on their survival. As night fell on August 2nd, he paddled out by himself into Ferguson Passage, hoping to attract the attention of a passing PT boat, but none came by. Kennedy eventually made it back to his crew the following morning after battling all night against punishing currents. The following night, Ensign Barney Ross made the same trip, again without success. By August 4th, the situation for the stranded crew was desperate as hunger and thirst set in, compounded by exhaustion. Desperate to find food and water, Kennedy organised the group to swim to the larger island of Olasana, a mile to the south. Once again, Kennedy took McMahon on his back for a slog across open water that took several hours, as the crew battled against a tough current. Kennedy and the others were concerned that this island might have Japanese troops on it, but by this stage, they were desperate enough to take the risk. When they arrived on Olasana, they were bitterly disappointed. There were no Japanese troops there, but also no fresh water, and little to eat apart from some unripe coconuts. To make matters worse, the weather then deteriorated, meaning they couldn't go out into Ferguson Passage that night. By the following morning, August 5th, the situation of the PT109 survivors was grim. But Kennedy refused to give up. That morning he took Ensign Ross and swam across to Nauru Island, another half-mile to the southeast, where they came across the wreck of a Japanese barge, close to which they found a small amount of food and water, along with a small canoe. It wasn't much, but at that point, it was everything. At the same time, the Solomon Islanders Byuku Gaza and Ironi Kumana were also at Nauru, investigating the very same barge wreckage. The two men were one of the local scout teams working for the Coast Watcher Reg Evans and were normally keeping an eye out for Japanese planes and ships to report their movements. But as they approached the shore this time, they spotted two badly sunburnt and unkempt men lurking on the island. Figuring that they were Japanese survivors of whatever had happened to the barge, the two scouts stopped in their tracks and paddled away. What happened next was pure chance. A little while after leaving Nauru, Gasser found that he was thirsty and persuaded Kamala to stop off at the nearby Olasana Island to find a coconut to drink. There they found more heavily sunburnt men and initially believed them to also be Japanese. It took the appearance of Ensign Lenny Thom, who possessed a striking blonde beard that marked him as clearly non-Japanese, to convince the scouts that they were in fact Americans. From here, things started to happen. The two scouts took Kennedy to Sub-Lieutenant Evans, who arranged for food and water to be delivered to the American survivors. They then made a 15-hour non-stop journey along with a third scout, John Carey, to Roviana Island, an American outpost from which contact could be made with the torpedo boat base on Rendova. Now aware of the survival of PT109's crew, Lieutenant Commander Warfield authorized a rescue attempt. That evening, Lieutenant Liebnau's PT157 was sent north, carrying the three local guides and, coincidentally, two reporters who happened to be visiting the base at the time. The lone torpedo boat made its way slowly across the open water, keeping its speed down to minimize its wake. It eventually picked Kennedy up before continuing on to Olasana and the rest of the stricken crew. They picked them up, turned around, and at 5:15 AM on August 8th returned to Rendova. 6 days and 3 hours after being wrecked, the battered crew of PT109 was saved. It had been an extraordinary ordeal for the crew. They were soon evacuated to Tulagi for recuperation and treatment for the more seriously injured among them, especially McMahon. He and William Johnston were later moved to other hospitals, while the rest of the crew were reassigned to other units after a few weeks. For Kennedy, the crash and 6 days of exposure had worsened his already existing health problems, but the story of PT109 and his wartime heroism during it became a powerful narrative tool in his post-war political career that would propel him eventually to the White House. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.